Snow moved across the empty Wyoming valley like drifting white smoke when Thomas Hale first saw the wagon coming up the long trail to his ranch. It was late afternoon, the sky pale and cold, and Thomas had just finished chopping wood beside the barn. For 15 years, his life had followed the same quiet pattern: wake before sunrise, feed the horses, mend fences, eat supper alone, then sit beside the fire listening to the wind move across the plains. He had not expected visitors. No one came this far unless they had a reason. Thomas leaned against the fence post, narrowing his eyes toward the distant wagon. The horse pulling it looked tired, and whoever was driving it seemed small against the wide land. By the time the wagon reached the front gate, the sun was already slipping behind the hills. Thomas walked slowly toward the porch of his cabin as the wagon stopped. The driver climbed down carefully. It was a young woman. She looked no older than 25, wearing a traveling coat dusted with road dirt. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a bonnet that had clearly seen better days. She looked up at the cabin, then at the tall rancher standing on the porch. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she stepped forward and said, "Excuse me, are you Mr. Thomas Hale?" Thomas crossed his arms. "That depends," he said slowly. "Who's asking?" The woman hesitated, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded letter. "My name is Eleanor Carter," she said. I believe I'm your mail-order bride." Thomas blinked once, then again. For a moment he thought he had misheard her. "My what?" She held out the letter with slightly trembling fingers. "The agency in Cheyenne arranged it," she explained. "You placed the request months ago." Thomas stared at the letter but did not take it. "I never wrote to any agency," he said flatly. The woman's expression slowly shifted from hopeful to confused. "But the letter says—" Thomas stepped down from the porch and took the paper from her hands. He unfolded it slowly. The message inside was short. It listed the ranch address. It listed his name, and it described the request for a wife willing to live on a remote cattle ranch. Thomas read it twice before lowering the paper. "I didn't write this," he said. The woman's face went pale. "But I sold nearly everything to come here," she whispered. "The agency told me you were expecting me." The wind moved across the prairie, carrying the smell of cold snow. Thomas rubbed his beard slowly as he thought. 15 years. 15 years since his wife had died from a sudden illness that swept through the valley one terrible winter. 15 years of silence inside this house. He had never once considered ordering a bride like some lonely ranchers did. Yet here one stood in front of him, and she had nowhere else to go. Eleanor looked down at the frozen ground. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "There must have been some mistake." She turned toward the wagon. "I'll just head back to town and try to figure out—" "Town's 30 miles away," Thomas interrupted. She paused. "And the storm coming over those hills will hit before dark." Eleanor looked toward the distant mountains. Gray clouds were rolling across the sky like heavy smoke. "You won't make it halfway before the snow closes the road," Thomas said. Silence settled between them. Eleanor slowly faced him again. "What should I do?" she asked softly. Thomas looked at the lonely wagon, the tired horse, and the frightened woman who had crossed half the country because of a letter he had never written. Finally, he sighed. "You better bring that horse into the barn," he said. Eleanor blinked. "You mean I can stay?" "Just until we figure this mess out," Thomas replied gruffly. Relief washed across her face so suddenly it almost made Thomas uncomfortable. "Thank you," she said. They worked together quietly to unhitch the wagon and settle the horse in the barn. Snow had already begun to fall lightly by the time they finished. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled warmly in the stone fireplace. Eleanor stepped inside carefully, looking around the simple room. It was clean but lonely. One table, 2 chairs, a worn couch, and shelves lined with tools and books. "You live here alone?" she asked. Thomas hung his coat by the door. Have for 15 years. She nodded slowly. I'm sorry if my arrival caused trouble, she said. Thomas shrugged. Ain't the strangest thing that's happened on this ranch? Eleanor smiled faintly. He placed a pot of coffee over the fire and pulled 2 cups from the shelf. You hungry? He asked. A little, she admitted. Thomas handed her a plate of bread and beans. They sat at the table, the storm growing stronger outside the windows. For a while they ate in silence. Finally, Eleanor spoke. If you didn't send for me, who did? Thomas leaned back in his chair. There's only one man in this valley dumb enough to play a trick like that, he muttered. Who? My neighbor, Jack Morgan. Eleanor looked surprised. Why would he do that? Thomas stared into the fire. Because he thinks 15 years alone is too long for any man. Eleanor studied his face quietly. You never wanted to remarry? Thomas didn't answer right away. Outside, the snowstorm began to roar across the plains. Inside the cabin, the firelight flickered across both of their faces. Finally, he said something that neither of them expected. I stopped thinking about it. Eleanor lowered her gaze to the table. Well, it seems fate didn't stop thinking about it. Thomas looked up at her. For the first time since she had arrived, he noticed the determination behind her quiet voice. This woman had crossed half a country alone because she believed someone out there wanted her. And somehow she had ended up at his door. The storm raged outside, sealing the ranch beneath thick snow. Thomas leaned back slowly and said, Looks like you're staying the night, Miss Carter. Eleanor nodded. Yes, it does. Neither of them realized it yet, but that strange mistake, one letter sent by a mischievous neighbor, was about to change the quiet ranch forever. And by the time the winter ended, Thomas Hale would realize that the unexpected knock on his door might have been the best mistake of his life. But on that first stormy night, neither of them knew what the coming weeks would bring. The wind howled across the plains like a restless animal, shaking the wooden walls of the cabin as snow piled higher outside the windows. Eleanor sat quietly at the small table, warming her hands around the cup of coffee Thomas had given her. The long journey had left her exhausted, but the warmth of the cabin slowly eased the tension in her shoulders. Thomas stood near the fireplace, adding another piece of wood to the flames. For years, this house had known only one set of footsteps, one voice, one life moving through its quiet rooms. Now there was another presence there, and it felt strange. Storm's going to last all night, he said finally. Eleanor nodded softly. I figured as much. Silence returned for a few minutes. The fire crackled gently between them. Finally, Eleanor looked up. If it really was your neighbor who sent that letter, she said carefully, he must have believed you needed someone here. Thomas gave a short, dry laugh. Jack Morgan's been trying to marry me off since my wife passed. He must care about you. Thomas shrugged. Or he's tired of hearing me complain about cold winters. Eleanor smiled faintly. The warmth of the room made her eyelids heavy, but she forced herself to stay awake. She still felt like a guest in someone else's life. There's a spare room down the hall, Thomas said after a moment. Bed's small, but it's warmer than the wagon. Thank you, she replied. She stood slowly and walked toward the hallway. Before disappearing into the room, she paused. Mr. Hale? Yeah. Even if it was a mistake, I'm grateful you didn't send me back out into the storm. Thomas nodded once. No decent man would. Eleanor closed the door quietly behind her. The cabin grew silent again except for the storm outside. Thomas sat down at the table and stared into the firelight. For 15 years, his life had been simple and predictable. But tonight, everything felt different, and he couldn't quite explain why. Morning arrived with brilliant sunlight reflecting across endless snow. Eleanor woke early and stepped into the kitchen. She noticed immediately that Thomas was already outside working near the barn. She glanced around the cabin. The place was tidy but clearly built for one person. She rolled up her sleeves and began moving quietly around the kitchen. Within an hour, the smell of frying bacon filled the room. When Thomas finally stepped back inside, brushing snow from his coat, he stopped in the doorway. He stared at the table. Eggs, bacon, fresh coffee. Eleanor looked up from the stove. "I hope you don't mind," she said carefully. Thomas removed his hat slowly. "Mind?" He walked to the table, studying the meal. "I can't remember the last time someone cooked breakfast in this house." They sat down across from each other. Eleanor watched his expression as he tasted the food. A slow smile appeared beneath his beard. "You cook better than any ranch hand I've hired," he admitted. She laughed softly. "Good thing, since I'm not much use with cattle." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "You didn't come all this way to cook for strangers forever." Eleanor looked down at her hands. "Truth is, I didn't have many choices left." Thomas studied her carefully. "Family?" "Gone," she said quietly. "Friends?" She shook her head. The rancher nodded slowly. He understood loneliness better than most. The day passed quietly. They cleared snow from the barn, checked the horses, and repaired part of a broken fence. Eleanor tried her best to help, even if she didn't know much about ranch work. Thomas found himself watching her more than once. She worked without complaint, and she laughed easily, even when she made mistakes. That evening, they sat by the fire again as the sky turned orange behind the hills. "You're welcome to stay until spring," Thomas said suddenly. Eleanor looked surprised. "Even if the letter was a mistake?" "Winter's not kind to travelers," he replied. She studied his face carefully. "And after spring?" Thomas hesitated. For 15 years, he had never imagined sharing his quiet life again. But now the house didn't feel quite so empty. He cleared his throat. "We'll figure that out when the time comes." Eleanor nodded slowly. A comfortable silence settled between them. The fire crackled softly. Snow glittered outside beneath the moonlight, and though neither of them spoke the thought aloud, both of them were beginning to realize that sometimes the strangest mistakes in life turn out to be the most beautiful beginnings.